Grace took a deep breath as she stood in front of her father's company. It was a place she had heard about her whole life, but had never felt a part of. Having recently returned from abroad after completing her master's degree, she had made a decision that many would have thought unexpected, to start her career as a cleaner. It had been her father's idea. He wanted his daughter to see the company from the inside, not through reports and meetings, but through the eyes of ordinary employees. He wanted her to understand how business really worked and, more importantly, how people treated those they did not consider influential. Grace didn't mind. She was curious. She wanted to see how employees acted when they thought they were dealing with someone without power or status. Dressed in simple clothes, she walked into the building with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "You must be Grace, Mrs. Callens," one of the senior employees said warmly. "Mr. Harry told me about you. Welcome." "Thank you, madam," Grace replied with a smile. Mrs. Callens led her into the main office, where the staff were already busy with their morning routine. "This is Grace, our new cleaning lady," she announced. "She'll be keeping this place clean." Some of the staff barely looked up, others nodded politely. But one man, Jack, leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "The cleaning lady, huh?" Grace pretended not to notice his dismissive tone. That's why she was here, to see who people really are when they think they're nobodies. The next morning, standing in front of the mirror, she adjusted her blue and white uniform. It felt strange. She'd always worn her best clothes, but now the uniform meant more. It was her ticket out into the real world, her chance to see life from a different perspective. Mother always said, "Wealth is a privilege, not a right." She herself grew up in modest circumstances and tried to instill in Grace a respect for work. From a young age, she taught her to cook, clean, and do household chores. Respect is not determined by money, it's determined by how you treat people, Grace recalled her mother saying as she tied her hair into a ponytail. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and headed to the office. As soon as she walked in, the air in the room seemed to change. Some of the employees barely noticed, but she was already beginning to see who they really were. The other employees looked at Grace with mild curiosity, but one person in particular seemed unimpressed. Jack. He was a senior employee, known for his arrogance and loud voice. He gave her an appraising look and smirked. "Here comes our new janitor," he drawled with a sneer. "How fortunate. I just spilled coffee on the table. Clean it up." Grace glanced at the table. The coffee had clearly been knocked over on purpose. The cup lay on its side, the dark liquid dripping onto the floor. She glanced at Jack, who had crossed his arms and was watching her as if he were performing. She felt a simmer of anger inside, but she reminded herself why she was there. Taking a deep breath, she picked up a rag and began mopping up the spilled coffee. "You're slow," Jack chuckled. "If you want to stay here, you better get used to working faster." Grace said nothing, continuing to clean with an unperturbed expression, although the heat of humiliation was rising in her cheeks. "That's better," he chuckled, leaning back in his chair. As soon as she finished, Jack demonstratively crumpled the sheet of paper and threw it right in front of her. "Oops," he said with false regret. "Looks like I missed the trash can." Grace clenched her fists, but swallowed her pride again and silently picked up the paper. Jack laughed contentedly. "That's better," he chuckled, leaning back in his chair. As soon as she finished, Jack demonstratively crumpled the sheet of paper and threw it right in front of her. "Oops," he said with false regret. "Looks like I missed the trash can." Grace clenched her fists, but swallowed her pride again and silently picked up the paper. Jack laughed contentedly. At that moment, she caught the eye of another employee, Max. Unlike Jack, he looked awkward. Their eyes met, and his gaze was silently apologetic. Grace smiled slightly, then walked away. She had only just begun her journey, but she already knew that this would be much more difficult than it seemed. As the days went by, Grace gradually settled into her new role. She arrived early each morning, dressed in her blue and white uniform, ready to work. She mopped the floors, wiped down tables, took out the trash. She didn't care about these tasks. The only thing that made her uncomfortable was Jack. He seemed to have made it his mission to make her stay at the company miserable. At first it was small things. He would deliberately throw trash in places she had just cleaned, talk to her in a condescending tone, make her redo work for no reason. But today he crossed the line. Grace was wiping down a table in the break room when Jack walked in, carrying a plastic bag of clothes. He threw it down on the table next to her with a bang. "Take these to the laundry," he ordered, "and make sure my white shirts are spotless." I like them fresh and clean. Grace frowned at the bag. I'm here to clean the office, not run personal errands. Jack raised an eyebrow and smirked. You're here to do whatever I tell you. Now, take it and move it. Jack nodded at the bag demandingly. Before Grace could respond, a voice came from across the room. It's not fair, Jack. Max, one of the employees who had been watching the situation, said firmly. She's a cleaning lady, not your personal maid. You can't make her wash your clothes. Jack slowly turned his head and smirked. Max. But he just shook his head. It's wrong, and you know it. Jack ignored him and turned back to Grace. Well, he asked, crossing his arms, are you going to take the clothes, or do I have to remind you who's in charge here? Grace felt the employee's eyes boring into her. She knew that many expected her to remain silent and give in, but this was too much. She took a deep breath, holding back her anger, and shook her head firmly. That's not part of my job, sir. There was a moment of silence in the room. Then Jack laughed loudly, his laugh full of mockery. Oh, so we have a little rebel here, huh? Before Grace could say a word, he grabbed the cup of water on the table and poured it over her head. The cold liquid ran down her hair, soaking her uniform. A sigh swept through the room. Several employees awkwardly looked away, feeling uncomfortable, while others giggled nervously, unsure of how to react. Grace stood still, water dripping from her face, but a fire was starting to ignite inside her. Grace's heart was beating fast, but she didn't allow herself to respond. She was here for a reason. Jack smirked. Next time, make sure the water you give me is cold. I don't drink warm water. Max slapped his hand on the table in irritation. That's enough, Jack. He just shrugged. Relax, Max. She's just a cleaner. It's her job to clean up the mess. Grace clenched her fists. Her wet clothes were sticking to her body, but she didn't allow herself to break. She had never felt so humiliated in her life, but she didn't cry or beg. She just took a deep breath, picked up a cleaning cloth, and began wiping the water off the table as if nothing had happened. Max looked at her with concern. Grace, he began, but she only shook her head, indicating that it was not worth it. Jack smirked smugly, enjoying the illusion of his power, but Grace knew something he did not. His time was running out. She had endured a lot in these past few days, humiliation, insults, unfair treatment, but she remained calm, watching and remembering who was kind and who was simply following Jack. Today, everything was different. It was late afternoon. Most of the employees were either sitting at their desks or taking a short break. Grace was cleaning the conference room when suddenly the door clicked behind her. She turned around. Jack stood by the door, leaning lazily against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. A smug smirk played across his face. You work hard, he drawled, taking a step forward. I like it. Grace tensed. There was something in his tone that made her insides clench. She knew these men too well, had faced their arrogance too often. They always thought they had the power, but she didn't give away her feelings. Her face remained impassive. I have work to do, Jack, if you don't mind. She tried to walk past him, but he reached out and touched her. His fingers lingered a little too long. Grace froze. You know, his voice dropped to an almost intimate whisper. I could make your life a lot easier. Her skin crawled. What do you mean? She asked tensely. Jack smirked. You're new, but I have connections. I could arrange for you to be treated better, give you opportunities, help you rise above this miserable cleaning job. He leaned closer. All you want, his voice was low, almost gentle, is to make me happy. Grace's stomach twisted in disgust. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. No, she said it firmly without hesitation. His smile faded slightly. Think about it, sweetheart. You work hard, but no one respects you. I could change that. I could protect you. Grace clenched her fists. I don't need your protection. Jack's face darkened. You have to. Be careful what you say. Jack leaned closer, his voice cold. I have a good reputation here, and no one would trust some cleaning lady. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears, but she didn't let her fear show. Maybe no one will believe me now, she said quietly. But people always show who they are, and sooner or later, they face the consequences. Jack chuckled. Big words for worthlessness. He swung the door open. You'll regret this. With that, he walked out, leaving only silence behind him. Grace exhaled, trying to stop herself from shaking. She had seen enough. As she stepped through the door, she was met with the gazes of the employees. Some looked sympathetic, Others avoided her eyes, pretending nothing had happened. But a few, including Max, kept staring at Jack, their expressions filled with obvious disgust. And then Grace realized, not everyone in this office was blind to what Jack was doing. Some were simply afraid to speak up, but soon there would be no need to be afraid. The day of the general staff meeting had arrived. Everything was supposed to go as usual, but Jack had no idea that today would change. Sophia, in her usual cleaning uniform, stood at the end of the conference room. The employees were taking their places, talking quietly. And Jack, as always, walked in with a smug grin, completely confident in himself. Jack had no idea that his world was about to change. At exactly 10 a.m., Mr. Adam, the CEO of the company, walked into the conference room. Conversations instantly died down as he took his place at the head of the table. Mr. Adam was always a reserved, calm man, but there was an air of authority in his voice. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I called this meeting to make a very important announcement, but before we begin," his gaze swept across the room and settled on Sophia, who stood quietly by the door. But before he could say a word, Jack's voice broke the tense silence. "Excuse me, sir," he said loudly, leaning back lazily in his chair. Then he turned to Grace and grinned. "But what is she doing here?" Grace held his gaze but said nothing. "This is a meeting for important people," Jack continued with a smug grin. "We don't need a cleaning lady. She needs to go." A few of the staff shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Max clenched his jaw, clearly holding back. He was about to say something, but before he could open his mouth, Mr. Adam raised his hand and the room fell silent for an instant. He took a slow, deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Jack," his voice was even, but there was a steel in it, "I personally invited Miss Grace to this meeting." Grace saw Jack hesitate, his confidence faltering. "But sir, she—" "That's enough," Mr. Adam said firmly. "You've said enough." Jack looked around the room, clearly confused. His fingers twitched nervously, the first sign of doubt in his confidence. Mr. Adams' gaze moved slowly around the table. "I've been preparing for some major changes in this company for months now," he continued. "As many of you know, I'll be retiring in a few months, and I've spent a lot of time choosing my successor carefully." A murmur ran through the room. Jack sat up slightly, adjusted his tie, and his smug expression returned. It was obvious he thought he had been chosen. Grace barely suppressed a smile. "And today," Mr. Adam paused, looking at everyone present, "I want to formally introduce to you the man who will take my place as the next CEO of the company." The room froze. Jack looked at Mr. Adam expectantly, sure that his name would be called. But instead, Mr. Adam turned to Grace. "My successor is Grace." In an instant, the room erupted in whispers. Someone gasped. Some employees froze in shock. Others exchanged glances in disbelief. And Jack went pale. "Grace," Jack repeated, blinking rapidly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Sir, that's impossible. She's just—" Mr. Adam interrupted him, and there was no longer any patience in his voice. "She's not just someone, Mr. Jack." The room froze. "She's my daughter, Miss Grace Adam." The silence that followed those words was almost deafening. "And all this time she's been working undercover to see the true character of the people in this company." Jack froze. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Grace lifted her chin, watching the realization slowly dawn on Jack's face. Everything he'd done, the insults, the humiliations, the harassment had been seen by the one person he should have feared most. And that was just the beginning of his downfall. The air in the room grew heavy. Jack looked like he'd just been punched. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by wide-eyed shock. This has to be a joke," he muttered, shaking his head. "Sir, but how can you put a low-level person in the CEO position?" Mr. Adam leaned forward, his gaze piercing Jack like a blade. "You know what happens when people make assumptions without knowing the facts?" Jack opened his mouth but found no words. Mr. Adam turned to his daughter. "Grace, tell them about your qualifications." She was still in her cleaning uniform, but now she stood up straight, confident. "I have a master's degree in human resources, as well as professional certifications in management and corporate leadership." Her voice was clear and even. There were gasps in the room. Several employees looked at each other, realizing that the man they had considered insignificant was far more qualified than many of them. Mr. Adam nodded. "I asked Grace to start at the bottom not because she was incompetent, but because I wanted her to understand this company. I wanted her to see for herself how things are run, how people behave, and who truly shares our values." Mr. Adams' voice grew sharper. What I didn't expect was for my own daughter to suffer such humiliation at the hands of someone who was supposed to be a leader. A tense silence fell over the room. Jack swallowed but quickly tried to regain his composure. Sir, he trailed off, forcing out an awkward laugh. Come on, we were just having fun. She was playing the role of a cleaning lady. How were we supposed to know? Mr. Adams' eyes flashed with anger. So you think it's okay to mistreat people if you don't think they're important? Jack shifted uncomfortably but found nothing to say. Grace reported everything to me, Mr. Adam continued. I know about the insults, humiliations, and unethical favors you tried to force on her. A sigh rippled through the room. Several of the staff looked at Jack with disgust. You thought you were untouchable. Mr. Adams' voice was level but icy. You thought your reputation would protect you, but your actions spoke louder. Jack gripped the edge of the table, his breathing becoming ragged. The confidence with which he wore his mask of power began to crumble. Grace watched him. At that moment, he finally realized that he had lost. Mr. Adam took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. There is no abuse of power in this company, Jack. Mr. Adam paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. Then coldly and clearly, he said, There will be consequences for your behavior. Jack's face lost all confidence. For the first time, he looked not smug, but afraid. The room was dead silent. All eyes were on him, the man who had thought himself untouchable just a moment before. But now his arrogance was gone. All that remained was panic. Mr. Adams sighed, his eyes filled with icy disappointment. Jack, effective immediately. You are fired. The air seemed to thicken. Jack's eyes widened in horror. Sir, please, you can't do this. But Mr. Adam didn't even flinch. There is no room in this company for people like you. I will not allow someone who abuses his position to remain here. Jack staggered, his hands shaking. Everything around him seemed to lose color. Sir, please, I have a family, a wife, children. They depend on me. Grace watched as desperation crept into his voice, as fear melted his once unshakable self-confidence. But no one was going to pity him. Mr. Adam leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanging. You forgot about your wife and children when you went after my daughter, didn't you? Jack opened his mouth, but no words came out. You've always treated those you considered beneath you like trash, Mr. Adam continued, his voice calm but firm. And now that it's time to answer for your actions, you beg for mercy. There was a dull thud as Jack fell to his knees. Please, sir, I made a mistake. I can change. Give me a chance. But Mr. Adam had already made up his mind. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Inspector? Yes, we're ready. Jack's eyes darted around the room, panicked. A murmur ran through the staff, realizing what was about to happen. No, Jack muttered, shaking his head. Sir, please don't do this. But before he could say anything else, the office doors swung open and 2 police officers walked in. Jack cowered at the sight of them, shaking all over. Mr. Jack, one of the officers said. Jack turned to Mr. Adam in despair, tears welling up in his eyes. Please, sir, I swear I didn't mean to hurt you. This is all some kind of misunderstanding. But Grace didn't feel an ounce of sympathy for him. She remembered his mockery, his threats, how he allowed himself to do things that were unnecessary without regard for her will. This was not a misunderstanding. Mr. Adam nodded silently. Take him away. One of the officers grabbed Jack's arm. The other took out handcuffs. No, please, he screamed, struggling desperately, but resistance was useless. The entire office watched in silence as the once powerful Jack was led away like a criminal. As he was led past Grace, he gave her a wild, hate-filled look. You did this to me. You ruined my life, he screamed. But no one was listening to him anymore. Grace met his gaze without fear. No, Jack, you have ruined yourself. The officers led him out the door, his pleas fading into silence as he walked down the hall. And just like that, he was gone. The office had changed. The tension that had been in the air for weeks seemed to dissolve, replaced by a mixture of relief, guilt, and reflection. Those who had laughed at Jack's cruel jokes now looked ashamed, avoiding Grace's gaze. Others, on the contrary, felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice had been done. Max straightened, knowing that they had done the right thing. Mr. Adam let the silence settle for a moment, then cleared his throat and spoke, his voice firm but calm. You have witnessed an important lesson today. Everyone in the room focused on him. This company is not mine alone, he continued. It belongs to you, the ones who work hard every day to make it a success. But success isn't just about numbers and profits. It's about our character. It's about how we treat each other. Not just our bosses, but those we might have grown accustomed to overlooking or dismissing as insignificant. He paused, letting his words sink in. There were those of you who chose kindness and honesty, despite the pressure to follow a bully. He looked at Max and a few other employees. And for that, you will be rewarded. A low murmur swept through the room. Mr. Adam turned to his assistant, Mrs. Colley. Mrs. Colley handed Mr. Adam the folder. He glanced at the contents and announced, "Effective immediately. Anyone who has demonstrated honesty and kindness in this office will be promoted and rewarded accordingly."
The room went silent.
People like Max, Mrs. Colley, and others who have stood up to injustice will be promoted to higher positions with adequate compensation. Several employees gasped. Max's eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Adam nodded. You made the right choice, even when it wasn't easy. That's the kind of leadership this company needs. Max swallowed, his hands shaking slightly. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Mr. Adam smiled. I have no doubt about it. Then he turned to Grace. His gaze softened, and he stepped forward, wrapping her in a warm embrace. I'm proud of you, he said. You've shown strength, wisdom, and patience. You've been through things no one should have to go through, but you've kept your dignity. Grace closed her eyes, immersing herself in the warmth of her father's embrace for a moment. This wasn't just a business matter for her. It was a matter of trust, respect, and fairness. She had earned her place not because she was the CEO's daughter, but because she had stepped up when others had fallen. Mr. Adam turned to the staff. Grace will be taking over as CEO, and I expect each of you to treat her with the same respect you would any other leader. She's worked hard, studied hard, and is more than ready to take on this role. Grace stepped forward and took a deep breath. As the new CEO, she said firmly, I promise that this company will be built on the principles of fairness, respect, and honesty. Here you will not be judged by your title, but by your actions. If you work hard, you will be rewarded. If you abuse your power, there will be consequences. A few employees nodded in agreement, while others still looked worried, processing what had just happened. But Grace had no doubt. Change had begun, and she was ready.